On September 16th, 2007, a farmer from upstate New York was cutting hay in his field. This field, which sat in Jefferson County, roughly 5 miles outside of the city of Watertown, was relatively isolated. If you would go a few miles down the busiest road, Arsenal Street, you would hit a small shopping area, which had a Target, Walmart, and a decent-sized mall. But out here, in this patch of farmland, there was very little other than homes and grass. As one internet commenter put it, quote, "There really isn't anything up there but farms, cold, snow, and cows." And that was very true for this farm, which was primarily overgrown grass and hay. The farmer was out here, on this mid-September day, trying to get a handle on the overgrown brush. As the grass and hay began to clear away though, something appeared. The farmer could not be sure, but it looked vaguely like a body. As they got closer, they realized that it was skeletal remains, still dressed in the clothing that this unknown person had likely died in. 2 differing agencies responded to this potential crime scene: the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department and the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. You see, as law enforcement would learn, this body belonged to a young man who had gone missing 6 months beforehand. Even though the cause and the manner of his death has never been established, investigators found ATM cards, jewelry, and a military ID belonging to a 24-year-old Army sergeant that had been stationed at nearby Fort Drum. He had disappeared in March of that year, under suspicious circumstances which linger to this day.
Press conference was called for this morning so that we can give you a tentative identification of the remains that we found in the town of Hounsfield on the 16th of this month. As you know, we had a subject that was reported missing last March. On the 19th of March, the last time he was seen was the early morning of the 16th of March. And the investigation certainly was ongoing for over a year, or close to a year. The remains that we found over the weekend, again, is tentatively that of Sergeant Patrick Rust, a Fort Drum soldier. There will be an autopsy performed by anthropologists in Washington to confirm the identity. At this time, I'd like to thank not only the Watertown Police and the State Police for their assistance out there, but certainly Fort Drum, the military police,
Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Michael Whelan. Before I get started, I just want to start off by saying a few things. First and foremost, I would like to extend a huge thank you and a debt of gratitude to Dennis Griffin, a noted true crime author and former host of the Crime Wire radio program. He contacted me a while ago to cover this story on Unresolved, and it would not have been possible without the information he has provided. So if you're listening, thank you, Denny. Secondly, I would like to tell you very briefly on how you can help support the podcast. If you could leave the podcast a rating and a review on iTunes, I know it's a slight inconvenience, but they really do help increase the exposure of a podcast. So that would be awesome. You could also give the podcast a donation on PayPal. Just enter the podcast email address, theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to become a patron. There you could get access to a handful of perks, including commercial-free episodes, early access, monthly episode polls, and soon, exclusive mini-episodes. The first of these, about the mysterious O'Hare incident of 2006, will be available very, very soon. Lastly, you can also support the companies that advertise on Unresolved, including today's sponsor, Wink. Wink is a company that combines 2 of my favorite things: alcohol that is personally tailored to my taste buds, and me not having to leave the house. Seriously. Wink, which is spelled W-I-N-C, is a service that makes it easy to discover wine. If you're like me, and have spent way too much time in the wine aisles looking at fancy labels, and having to Google the difference between Pinot Noir and Pinot Grigio, then Wink is for you. When you go to trywink.com/unresolved, you'll be greeted by a palate profile quiz, which asks you questions like, how do you like your coffee? And how do you feel about blueberries? From there, Wink selects wines that are personally curated to your taste and sends you as many as you want, starting at just $13 a bottle. For the record, this is not a wine club. There are no membership fees, you could skip a month or cancel at any time, and if you don't like a bottle that Wink sends you, you could have it replaced with another. No questions asked. This is a great way to discover wines that you'll enjoy drinking, and you could do it without having to leave the house, which is my favorite part. You can save $20 from your first order by heading to trywink.com/unresolved. Once again, that's trywinc.com/unresolved. Now, without any further ado, let's turn back the dial to the early 2000s and learn a little bit more about the young man at the center of today's mystery. Patrick Rust was born on June 3rd, 1982, in Ogdensburg, New York, up north in St. Louis County, which rests right along the border between New York and Canada. His parents, Judith and Rodney Rust, had divorced sometime in his youth, but remained amicable for Patrick's sake. He had one full-blooded sister and 3 half-brothers. At some point, his family relocated to the town of Russell, New York, where he attended Edward Knox High School. He graduated in the first half of 2001, and originally planned to attend vocational school to become a welder. But in this first year of working and attending vocational school, an event triggered a change in Patrick's life plans: 9/11. Patrick, being a native New Yorker, felt a compulsion to join the military. In May of 2002, he officially joined the Army, and he went through basic training that summer, a task I do not envy him for. He went through basic at Fort Sill, Oklahoma between June and August of 2002, and he was sent for his advanced individual training soon thereafter, between August and October of that year, in Fort Bliss, Texas. After going through training, he was assigned to the 10th Mountain Division, where he spent the duration of his military commission. The 10th Mountain Division is and was stationed at Fort Drum, which is in Watertown, New York, very close to the area in upstate New York where Patrick had actually grown up. In fact, many of Patrick's friends and families considered him a, quote, local, in that he knew the area of Watertown very well. This would actually become relevant to the story later on, so just keep that in mind. On April 22nd, 2003, Patrick took his first step into a larger and more dangerous world. He was deployed overseas to Iraq, as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. It was his first deployment, and would see him in Iraq until November of 2004, nearly 19 months later. During this deployment, his duties included walking the perimeter of an army post, acting as a sort of guard. He returned home to Fort Drum in the final days of 2004, but would deploy again a little over a year later. This time, he was sent to Afghanistan as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. During this deployment, which lasted from February of 2006 to January of 2007, he primarily manned a truck-mounted gun. Upon his return to New York, in January of 2007, he proceeded to take 30 days of leave, a brief vacation from the stresses of military life in the hopes of acclimating himself back to his regular life once again. By all indications, Patrick enjoyed himself during this time. He was 24 years old, with 2 deployments under his belt already, and he had just recently renewed his military contract. In fact, he had just received a new assignment, which was taking him to the other side of the country, Washington State's Fort Lewis. Despite growing up in the relatively quiet upstate New York, Patrick's friends and family recall him as being very excited for the change in scenery. During his travels to the Middle East, and even before when he was going through training, he had become anxious to travel, and he wanted to see much more of the world. When Patrick returned from his 30-day leave in February, he resumed his regular duties at Fort Drum. Of course, this also brought him back to the barracks on post, often seen as the opposite of luxurious. If you talk to an active duty service member, I'm sure that they'll tell you all about how the barracks, sometimes called the dorms, are lacking in some way or another. Whether it be the constantly low warm water in the showers, or the uncomfortable beds, or even the occasional mold and mildew that occasionally grows unchecked. Needless to say, Patrick was pretty eager to get out of the barracks. A month later, in March of 2007, Patrick made plans to move out with a fellow soldier he had befriended roughly 15 months beforehand. This potential roommate, named Robert Van Velsen, was described as a skinny and geeky fellow that mainly kept to himself. On March 14th, a Wednesday, Patrick moved into an apartment with this other soldier. Patrick was happy to simply get out of the dorms, and he did not seem to mind that the apartment in question, located at 156 Sterling Street in downtown Watertown, was only one bedroom. It was hinted that Patrick would be sleeping in the living room, but later sightings indicated that the roommate, Robert Van Velsen, who was the only person on the lease, had his own stuff in the living room. It's possible that Patrick was planning to have the only bedroom to himself. Either way, it was going to make for quite a cramped living arrangement. The following day, March 15th, 2007, a Thursday, all seemed to be well. Patrick and his new roommate, Robert Van Velsen, worked the same schedule, so they were able to carpool together. This was a big benefit for Patrick, who did not have a driver's license or a car of his own. At around 5 p.m. that Thursday, they were released from duty and they headed home together. Patrick hitched a ride with his new roommate, and they got to the apartment pretty quickly. At around 5:30, Patrick's roommate, Robert, heard Patrick talking on the phone with an old friend. This friend, who lived in Colorado, was apparently visiting the area, and they were hoping to hang out together sometime soon. At 6:30 or so, Robert was headed out to visit the nearby Salmon Run Mall, which is about 2.8 miles away from their apartment on Sterling Street. Patrick decided to go with him. While they were at the mall, Patrick bought a couple of games for his PSP and a CD at the Best Buy. Robert and he then grabbed some food from Wendy's in the mall's food court. During this trip to the mall, a couple of intriguing breadcrumbs would present themselves. The first of which was a series of calls made and accepted by Patrick himself. Between 6:32 and 6:39 p.m., the time which he was heading to the mall with Robert and just arriving there, he had two small, brief conversations with another soldier named Dylan Rustmeyer, a specialist in the Army. These calls would become relevant later on. He also had a phone conversation with his father and his father's girlfriend, in which they spoke about their plans for the upcoming weekend. You see, that weekend, namely the following day, March 16th, was his father's birthday. So Patrick was planning to spend the weekend with his dad and a couple of their relatives for a bit of a guys' weekend. His father and his father's girlfriend said that it sounded like Patrick was walking, based on his breath patterns. It's possible that he was just walking in the mall, but this would become a point of contention later on. The second breadcrumb this trip would leave behind is a cash withdrawal made by Patrick at an ATM in the Salmon Run Mall. This was the fourth such withdrawal he had made that week, with each being $200, the max total allowed by his credit union. The first three had come in successive days from earlier that week, March 11th, 12th, and the 13th. It would later be theorized that he had made all of these withdrawals in preparation of the upcoming weekend. With it being his father's birthday, and his father facing a tough time financially, he was perhaps preparing to bankroll their guys' weekend. This would also become a point of contention later in the story. Patrick and his roommate, Robert, left the mall at approximately 7:50 p.m., about an hour and 15 minutes after arriving there. Robert, Patrick's new roommate, wanted to stop by Totally Tan Sun Center on the corners of Arsenal and South Massey Streets to get a tan. Robert Van Velsen, Patrick's new roommate, wanted to stop by Totally Tan Sun Center on the way home. Patrick did not want to stick around for the length of time it would take Robert to get a tan, so he decided to walk home. From the area of this tanning location, it would be a little over half a mile back to their apartment complex on Sterling Street. Despite the temperature being pretty chilly, it was just about freezing at 8 o'clock that evening. Robert described Patrick as being, quote, calm, cool, and collected as he walked out into the brisk evening air. It is worth noting that Patrick was not wearing a coat this evening, which would become noteworthy as the temperature continued to drop into the lower 20s and the upper teens. Military investigators would later claim that the soldier Patrick had spoken to on the phone a little over an hour beforehand, Army Specialist Dylan Rustmeyer, had happened to come across Patrick during this walk home. Rustmeyer said this happened at around 7:55 p.m., and that it was more of a chance encounter than a pre-planned meetup. However, one thing that investigators would later theorize is that another person had been with Dylan Rustmeyer during this period of time, a man named Scott Grant. Grant, just like Rustmeyer, was also in the military, an army specialist, and would become a major person of interest in this case later on, so keep his name fresh in your mind. By the admission of Dylan Rustmeyer, he picked up Patrick a little before 8 p.m., and he drove him the remaining blocks to his apartment building. He said that he dropped him off sometime around 8:10 p.m., and that when Patrick left, he either did not wait around to see him go inside, or he just wasn't paying attention. By the time that Robert Van Velsen, Patrick's roommate, arrived home to their apartment at roughly 8:30 p.m., he claims that Patrick was already gone. So, either he had left in the 20 minutes between being dropped off by Dylan Rustmeyer, or the chance encounter and the ride back home had not happened as Dylan Rustmeyer claimed. Patrick's roommate, Robert Van Velsen, went to bed sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock that night, and made a mental note that Patrick had not yet returned home. At some time between 9 and 9:30 p.m., Patrick was seen arriving at a bar named Clueless. Clueless, which has since been shut down and rebranded, was known in the area for being the local alternative lifestyle hotspot. While it was well known for being Watertown's lone gay and lesbian bar, it was accepting of all sexualities and genders. Located on 545 Arsenal Street, Clueless was actually pretty close to the Totally Tan Sun Center that Patrick's roommate had visited an hour or so beforehand. However, it is also about a mile away from the apartment building Patrick had just moved into on Sterling Street. While a mile is not a terribly long walk, the sun had already sunk below the horizon and the temperature was dropping quickly, making it quite the endeavor, especially for someone not wearing a jacket or a coat. The manager of Clueless, Billy Ritz, was bartending on the night in question. In fact, more often than not, it was Ritz that was working the bar and dealing with patrons at various stages of intoxication. He was familiar with the locals and the regulars, and when Patrick came walking in by himself a little after 9 p.m., Billy said he looked a little anxious, perhaps nervous about coming into a place like this by himself. Now, before I continue on, I want to address one of the elephants in the room, the question that is Patrick's sexuality. Many people have theorized that him coming into a bar that was most well known for being a gay and lesbian hotspot is a clue of his true nature, but there has not been a single shred of proof that Patrick was gay or bisexual in the years since. At the time of this incident, he was actually in the middle of 2 separate relationships with young women. Even the friends of Patrick that were gay had no indication of him being anything other than heterosexual. So, while it's possible that Patrick was coming into this bar for more than just a drink, there has been very little proof or evidence that it was anything other than a coincidence. On the night in question, a Thursday, March 15th, there were between 8 and 10 people in the bar, and according to the manager, Billy Ritz, it was a quiet night that had no real attraction. No DJ, no live music, nothing like that. Just a handful of regulars, and then Patrick, whom Billy, who worked there bartending almost every single night, had never seen before. Patrick apparently ordered a drink or two, and he kept to himself for a period of time, until he saw a friendly face. Patrick Law shared not only a first name with Patrick Rust, but the two had been classmates back in high school. Patrick Law, who I'll try to refer to with his last name to avoid any confusion, had been Patrick's friend once upon a time, but they had lost touch in the years since. Patrick Law was at Clueless with his boyfriend, another Fort Drum soldier named Travis Walter. The two were regarded as roommates at the time, due to the military's don't ask, don't tell provision, but they were quite openly dating. The two Patricks talked for a good chunk of time, catching up on each other's lives from the preceding years. As they talked, they also drank a good amount, with some patrons describing Patrick Rust as being very animated. However, throughout their conversation, the boyfriend of Patrick Law, Travis Walter, seemed to be getting a bit frustrated at the amount of attention Patrick Rust was getting. Managing bartender Billy Ritz described this eventually leading to a small argument between the couple. Ritz also says that Walter made the decision to leave early that evening, at around midnight, leaving his boyfriend behind to continue catching up with Patrick Rust. This is disputed by Walter, who later claimed that he stayed there all night and did not get into an argument. Throughout the evening, the two Patricks, Law and Rust, continued to chat and have some drinks at Clueless. Both seemed to be in good spirits throughout the night. They went outside for a couple of smokes breaks throughout this time, using the back door of the venue, which was the primary entrance and exit. The staff and regular patrons all knew that the front door was used exclusively for food and beverage deliveries. In fact, there were signs on and around the door marking it as exclusively an emergency exit. As the night began to come to an end, the two Patricks decided to get each other's phone numbers so they could keep in touch, and hopefully they'd be able to hang out again sometime soon. One patron at the bar said that, over the course of the evening, Patrick had mentioned going to another bar in nearby Syracuse. I have not been able to find any confirmation of this, but I feel like it's worth including. At around 1 a.m. on the morning of Friday, March 16th, the two Patricks were still at Clueless. Patrick Rust went up to the bar to order another drink, but the bartender decided to cut him off. When he insisted on getting another rum and coke, he was instead given just a glass of the soda. There were some rumors that cropped up later on that Patrick was on some kind of drug, or was perhaps trying to score some drugs during this evening outing, namely cocaine, but the bartender, Billy Ritz, does not recall any of this actually happening. In fact, he said that he did not notice any signs of Patrick being high on anything, but that the young man just appeared to be really, really drunk. There were 10 or less people in the bar that evening, and he did not recall cocaine being brought up in conversation at all. When Patrick Law stepped out for a smoke break at a little after 1 a.m., the bar was mostly empty, save for a few remaining patrons. Bartender Billy Ritz says that he did not see Patrick Rust leave the bar, but he knew that he had left when he looked up, and not only was Patrick gone, but the front door to the bar was open. It seemed to him at the time that Patrick had perhaps needed to step outside to throw up, and walked through the nearest door, disregarding the emergency exit only signs posted around the front door. However, neither of the Patricks would be seen again by the bartender that evening. Very little is known about the path that Patrick Rust took from this point forward. It seems like him and his former classmate Patrick Law went their separate ways, based on a series of phone calls that they would make over the next half hour or so. At 1:03 a.m., Patrick Rust received a 21-second phone call from Patrick Law. Then he received another 11-second call at around 1:04:07. I only mark the milliseconds on that call because it lasted a little over 11 seconds, and it would be followed up by a third call to Patrick's phone less than half a minute later, at 1:04:33. This third incoming call to Patrick's phone lasted around 206 seconds, which is about 3.5 minutes. This is noteworthy because, in 2007, Verizon limited the time on cell phone voicemails to 2 minutes even. So if a call lasted any longer than 120 seconds, you could be pretty positive that it was not a voicemail, but an actual conversation. However, this 206-second conversation at 1:04 would not be the last known activity from Patrick's phone in the early morning hours of this Friday. At 1:36:32, his phone made a brief 6-second outgoing call to the phone of Patrick Law, the classmate he had supposedly said goodbye to half an hour beforehand. Because this call lasted only 6 seconds, it's very likely that it was a hang-up, but it was then followed by another call at 1:36:39, just seconds later. This call also went out to Patrick Law, and records indicate that it lasted for 148 seconds, which is right at the time limit for a call to go to voicemail at this point in 2007. News reports would later indicate that a voicemail left for Patrick Law had been Patrick Rust drunkenly professing his kinship for the other man, and he expressed a desire to hang out more often. It's possible that this had been the final phone call, made at 1:36 a.m. However, it's impossible to tell because Patrick Law has never been questioned by authorities about these calls. This 1:36 a.m. phone call was the final outgoing call made by Patrick Rust's cell phone. While his phone would continue to receive calls over the next couple of days, all of these calls going to voicemail, it would eventually stop receiving anything just a few days later. His Verizon account became officially inactive on March 21st, 5 or so days after leaving the bar clueless. By that time, the mystery of his whereabouts had begun. Robert Van Velsen, Patrick's newfound roommate, woke up at a little after 1 a.m. He says that he woke up at around this time every night to check his emails for work, a claim that I obviously cannot verify. However, at this point, Robert says that he poked his head into the room that Patrick had just moved into to see if the other man had made it home. He noted that Patrick was still gone before going back to bed. At around 5 a.m., Robert again woke up and began preparing for work. He saw that Patrick Rust had not yet returned home. Robert claims that he made an attempt to call Patrick's cell phone, but there is no record of such a call in Patrick's phone logs. Despite there being no proof that Patrick's roommate had actually tried calling him, this roommate then took the step of texting their supervisor, Staff Sergeant Revelino Saw. In this text message, he said that Patrick had not yet come home from that night and would likely not be at their 0730 formation. Staff Sergeant Saw later noted that this was very surprising. It wasn't often that he would get a text message informing him that someone would be absent from formation more than 2 hours before it was taking place. It was even more odd because it was not Patrick texting him, but another squad member that had been his roommate for only a day or so. Also, Patrick did not have a history of missing formation or even being late. Robert Van Velsen then called Sergeant First Class Melissa Aaron at around 6 a.m., telling her the same thing that he had just told the staff sergeant, that Sergeant Patrick Rust had not come home the night before, and he would likely miss the morning's formation. Some of the experts and analysts that have handled the case in the years since have pointed out that Robert Van Velsen, Patrick's roommate, did not make a verified attempt to contact Patrick until 6:22 a.m., after he had already texted Staff Sergeant Revelino Saw and SFC Melissa Aaron to let them know that Patrick would be gone that day. They point to this as being odd behavior, perhaps implying that he knew something had happened to his new roommate. And that's not me pointing this out as odd behavior, but rather former law enforcement and private investigators that have examined the case. As I said, Robert tried making a call to Patrick at 6:22 a.m. This was the first contact that Patrick's cell phone had seen since his final outgoing call at 1:36 a.m. It was a nearly 5-hour gap that would prove the most troubling for investigators, as people began to wonder what in the hell had happened to this promising sergeant. That Friday, March 16th, was the birthday of Patrick's father, Rodney. They had long been planning a guys' weekend, which Patrick had been pretty excited about. Not only was his family aware of his excitement, but so were many of his friends and his fellow soldiers. Patrick was supposed to call his dad later that Friday, so they could arrange a time for Patrick to get picked up and they could commence their weekend. However, that phone call never came, and Patrick's father just assumed that something work-related had come up. He did not show up to work that Friday, as expected, and the military became aware of his absence. He was officially reported as being absent without leave, also known as AWOL. Before he was officially reported missing, however, Patrick's personal effects were taken and inventoried by his supervisor. Staff Sergeant Revelino Saw, who had received the text message from Patrick's roommate on the morning of March 16th, conducted this inventory upon the orders of SFC Melissa Aaron, who was in turn his supervisor. Sergeant Joseph Dorr, another soldier in the 10th Mountain Division, was there for the inventory of Patrick's possessions, but he was not listed on any of the Army's documentation. This act, taking all of Patrick's personal effects, not only what he had left over in his barracks, but also the stuff that he had in his apartment at 156 Sterling Street, has become perhaps the biggest point of contention in this case. After all, you essentially had what could be considered evidence taken into the possession of the Army before Patrick was even reported missing. The military initially stated that this was part of their standard procedure for dealing with AWOL service members, but some vocal critics say that this stands in direct opposition with Army Regulation 638-2, also known as the, quote, care and disposition of remains and disposition of personal effects. This statute specifically prohibits entering off-base civilian housing to remove the personal effects of deceased or missing soldiers. despite these items being taken and inventoried that weekend, sometime between Friday, March 16th and Sunday, March 18th. The paperwork was filled out and dated on Monday, March 19th. This form, which is a DD 1750, was signed by only one person, Staff Sergeant Revelino Saw. It did not include the name of Patrick's roommate, Robert Van Velsen, nor the officer that was present for the inventory along Staff Sergeant Saw, Joseph Dorr, or the commanding officer that ordered the inventory, SFC Melissa Aaron. On the same day that this paperwork was dated, Monday, March 19th, Staff Sergeant Saw and Joseph Dorr went to the Watertown Police Department to report Sergeant Patrick Rust missing. They stated that he had not been seen since the evening of March 15th, and he was then treated as an ATL, also known as a attempt to locate. These are generally people that aren't seen as being in any real danger. Rather, you just want to find them for their own safety. ATLs are very similar to what we know as BOLO alerts. Be on the lookout. During this visit to Watertown PD, Staff Sergeant Saw and Sergeant Dorr gave no indication that they had already cleared out the 156 Sterling Street apartment of Patrick's possessions. After this visit by his squad mates, police began to reach out to Patrick's family and friends to try and locate him. However, the investigation to find him in earnest would not start until the very next day, when both of Patrick's parents, Judy and Rodney, came in at different times to file missing persons reports. At this point, Tuesday, March 20th, 2007, Patrick had already been missing for at least 4 days. Both the local Watertown PD and the military police that were conducting their own investigation began reaching out to the people that knew Patrick. In a written statement, Staff Sergeant Saw said that he was ordered to clear the barracks and the apartment of Patrick's belongings. At the time, he did not clarify who had ordered him to do so. That information would come to light years later, when Saw spoke to private investigator Denny Griffin. In his own written response, Sergeant Robert Van Velsen, Patrick's roommate, had an odd response that raised some alarms. When he was asked a question along the lines of where he thought Patrick might have gone, he wrote, quote, "If I had $27,000 in the bank, I'd be in Canada if I wasn't already dead." This statement was alarming because it was the first time that anyone had publicly raised the possibility of Patrick being dead, and it also put the emphasis on the state of Patrick's finances. At the time, Patrick was banking with a military credit union, likely either Navy Federal or USAA, and his mother, Judy, was not able to access any of Patrick's financial activity. She could not check to see if his account had been used recently, or if there was an amount like $27,000 in any of his accounts. When CrimeWire host and private investigator Denny Griffin began looking at this case in 2010, he had some of his CrimeWire analysts look over the written statements of both Sergeant Van Velsen and Staff Sergeant Saw. These analysts saw some signs of intentional deception when the two were addressing the subject of drugs, namely cocaine. Rumors of some kind of connection to cocaine and/or other drugs have lingered just below the surface of this case in the nearly decade since. And this has definitely helped stoke those fires. I cannot tell you for certainty whether these allegations have any merit, but I'd feel better including them than leaving it out. There were some other rumors that cropped up during this time span, in the initial week or so of the investigation to find Patrick Rust. These rumors consisted of Patrick getting into an argument with an ex-girlfriend on the night he disappeared, or perhaps he might have gotten into an altercation with this ex-girlfriend's current boyfriend. Again, this is just a rumor that, without a time machine, I cannot verify. But it was something that police were investigating in this early period of the investigation, and it would go on to muddle the picture that the investigators were beginning to paint. Over the next several months, the investigation really went nowhere. Military police had committed to the belief that Patrick had willingly gone AWOL and considered him derelict of his duties. For a time, the military investigators continued to follow up on leads that suggested Patrick was alive after he had been reported missing. His phone had gone dead just days after his disappearance, on either March 18th or 19th, but a couple of physical sightings kept hope alive that this was all some misunderstanding. On March 30th, roughly 2 weeks after he had gone missing, a Fort Drum soldier spotted someone, quote, who looked like Sergeant Rust. This unknown person was standing near the corner of Coffeen and North Massey Streets. According to this witness, quote, I rolled my window down and called out his name. The person that I thought looked like Sergeant Rust, after calling the name, he fled down Coffeen Street. This unknown person, who looked like Patrick Rust, had apparently stared at this witness for anywhere between 10 and 15 seconds before running off. It's also worth noting that this location, the corner of Coffeen and North Massey Streets, is roughly half a mile from where Patrick had last been seen, in the early morning hours of March 16th. Another witness, a woman that had been previously unfamiliar with Patrick Rust, claimed to have seen someone that looked like him in a dark area of the Paddock Club, just down Arsenal Street. This is about the area that Patrick had been picked up by another soldier after leaving the tanning salon on the evening of March 15th, nearby Watertown's public square. However, she claimed to see Patrick at the Paddock Club, one of the area's hottest spots for nightlife, on May 1st, roughly a month and a half after his disappearance. She had claimed to have never seen him before this day, and not since. She apparently saw him at the Paddock Club and thought nothing of it, but after seeing his face on a missing persons poster, everything seemed to click for her and she reported the sighting to police. As if these two physical sightings weren't enough, military police had another reason to think that Patrick might still be alive. Between the time of his disappearance and the end of the following month, April, someone had logged into his MyPay account and attempted to make changes. If you're unfamiliar, MyPay is where soldiers and service members can access their pay and benefit information, and where they can make changes to their accounts, such as changing their bank account information, their address, contact information, etc. On March 30th, 2007, the same day that this other soldier spotted Patrick out and about in Watertown, someone had actually logged into his MyPay account for an unknown reason. Then, nearly a month later, on April 26th, 2007, someone had logged into the account and attempted to enter a change of address. A senior MyPay consultant told police that it would have been, quote, very difficult for anyone other than Sergeant Rust to access this account, implying that it had been done by Patrick or someone very close to him. During these months of him being missing, police verified that none of his bank accounts had been touched. His cell phone account showed no signs of outgoing activity after the early morning hours of March 16th. His phone had continued to receive calls for a couple of days after, but stopped at some point between March 18th and March 19th. His Verizon account activity officially ceased on March 21st. Within a month or two, police just stopped asking questions. Neighbors that lived in the apartment building on Sterling Street stated that police never even stopped by to ask them any questions. And that included both civilian detectives in the Watertown Police Department and the military police that were conducting their own investigation. Maybe each expected the other to be handling the particulars in this case, but several witnesses and pieces of evidence continued to fall through the cracks. It wasn't until September of 2007, 6 months after Patrick's disappearance, that the case began to draw attention once again.
Hey, approximately 5:30 this evening, received another call of possible human remains off the Old Rome State Road. Patrols arrived on scene, and it does appear at this time that a second body has been found. It does appear to be human remains. This does not look like it's anything to do with the one over on the other road, but it certainly appears to be human remains.
Any idea how long remains been here?
No, it's been some time. The exact time we don't know. Dr. Livingston will be arriving out here shortly. Again, we'll have patrols posted out here, and until sometime tomorrow when we can actually do a good grid search of the area. Because of the lighting tonight, we'll be losing that shortly.
Are we talking about bones or a body?
It's human remains. There is some clothing with it, so hopefully that'll aid our investigation. It's a hayfield. The owner of the property was out here and discovered it while he was out here and reported it immediately.
You following any leads yet as to who this may be?
Again, we have, there's right now probably 3 to 4 people that we have missing, a couple from within the city, one out in the county. So we are following leads up on those people.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. What you have just heard is part 1 of a really tragic and complicated story. I really wanted to separate the before and the after of Patrick's remains being discovered, because I do view each of them as being almost 2 separate entities. I think you'll notice the difference and the way the investigations were treated when you hear part 2 next week. In between now and then, if you have any questions, concerns, or on the off chance that anyone has a compliment to share, I'd love to hear all of them. You can email them to theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com or to me personally at michael@unresolved.me. And as I unfortunately have to say, that's Michael with the E before the A. So just keep that in mind in case you're sending emails so they don't get stuck in the weird Google black hole of the internet. You could find the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and now Instagram. If you search for Unresolved Pod with no spaces or dashes, you should be able to find them quite easily. There's also a Facebook discussion group where I pop in with my own thoughts and opinions from time to time. If you want to leave the podcast a voicemail or send in a text, you could do so by giving 831-200-3550 a try. Once again, that's 831-200-3550. In the intro, I detailed the ways you can help support the podcast, but as always, your iTunes ratings and reviews are always appreciated. You can also head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to become a patron and get access to a couple of cool perks. If you missed anything I just told you, you could head to the podcast website at unresolved.me to find it, as well as read transcripts of each episode, find news sources or links to the music heard throughout, etc. I would like to give a huge thank you to my friend Miranda, who has been helping me update the website and is responsible for the new splash of paint it just received. So if you're listening, thanks Miranda. As an outro, I'll be playing a promo for the podcast Yours in Murder. It's hosted by some lovely friends of mine, Rachel and Rebecca, who are not only sisters with an interest in the macabre, but they're pretty delightful to listen to. Give their promo a listen and check them out. Their podcast is really interesting and a lot of fun, and I look forward to hanging out with them at this year's CrimeCon. Anyhow, I'll be back next week with part 2 of this tragic and complicated story. If you would like to hear other stories like this one, make sure to check out my other podcast, Hoax, which has an episode of its own coming out this weekend. And that one is going to be a doozy. But until next time, everyone, stay safe, and I'll talk to you all again very, very soon.
What do you want in a true crime podcast?
Do you want well-researched material, but an easy-to-follow format?
Do you want a bit of dark humor, but want sensitive topics handled, well, sensitively?
Do you want hosts who are lactose intolerant, but eat macaroni and cheese anyway?
Well, I think you might be looking for us. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Rebecca, and we're the hosts of the true crime podcast, Yours in Murder. And this isn't any old true crime podcast. I have a background in forensic science.
And I have a background in journalism, so we're able to combine our knowledge and bring you interesting new perspectives on cases.
Not that we're all serious. We have a bit of a dark sense of humor.
Just a bit. I mean, we like morbid jokes and cat jokes.
Lots of cat jokes. So if you're looking for something new and a bit out of the ordinary, check out Yours in Murder.
You can find us on all of your favorite podcatchers, as well as iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and TuneIn.
You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or check out our website at yoursinmurder.net.
We hope to see you soon, and until next time, we are Yours in Murder.